So we're following a book from Chuck Swindoll, Moses, a Man of Selfless Dedication. We're into chapter 4, Lessons Learned from Failure. By way of background, the failure was when he was 40 years old. He decided his way that he was going to be the liberator of the Hebrews. He killed the Egyptians. The whole thing backfired, and he ended up on retreat because he was afraid Pharaoh was going to kill him. And so here you see Moses, 40 years old, and Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and his deeds. He was well educated, he was well spoken, he was mighty, he had power over people, he was vulnerable. He knew the will of God, but he did not know the God of that will. And so Pharaoh heard about the murder, and he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. That word Midian is an interesting word because it means contention. There was contention between Moses and Pharaoh, and Moses bailed out. There's Moses as he was before the fact, and there's Moses fleeing. And so I find Exodus chapter 2, verse 21 interesting. Moses was content in the land of contention. But here's a verse from Paul. We'll get to that shortly. He was not content in Egypt. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. King James says the pleasures of sin for a season. He was not content at the well. Now, Proverbs wasn't written at that point, but I can see Moses saying this. I'm tired. He just marched over 150 miles from Egypt to Midian. I'm tired. I'm worn out. Boy, am I stupid. I've said that about myself many, many times. I've not learned wisdom, nor have I the knowledge of the Holy One. Moses was down. This is an interesting verse from Philippians. Paul says, not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned to be content. And that's what the 40 years in the desert, that's what it's all about. Moses had to learn that he was nothing. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. And in every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Now, Moses was raised, the saying, with a silver spoon. He left all of that, the education, the riches, the power, everything, because he was going to die. So he's at the well, and if he could, he'd be quoting Proverbs chapter 30, and he's going to be in a gradual growth pattern from the time he meets that well to the time when he gets to the bush. And once he's done with that conversation at the bush, and that'll be next Sunday if the clock behaves itself. When he's done talking to the bush, he can say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so 2 lessons about the well. The first one, to be still. The second one, the word of God. And the message, the application for us is, we're thirstier than we realize. Lessons learned from failure. Introduced with some famous failures. Now, this is an interesting one. Thomas Edison was asked about the light bulb, and he said, I did not fail 10,000 times. I've successfully found 10,000 ways that the light bulb wouldn't work. Then there's Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, if you know his story, had many failures before he was elected president. And I'm not going to go through all those, but you can see that he did not give up. He was a man of failure to ultimately become one of, if not the greatest president of the United States. Anybody know who Gene Kranz is? He was the mission controller of Apollo 13, and he said, failure is not an option. Well, Apollo 13 had a happy ending. Moses in the desert had a happy ending. And we're going to have happy endings also. Benjamin Franklin, experience is the best teacher, but a fool will learn from no other. C.S. Lewis, experience, that most brutal of teachers, but you learn. My God, do you learn. So there's Moses and there's the well. Thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against thee. And probably each of us can quote that. It's the good King James, but there are some other verses in Psalm 19 there as well. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. My first pastor told the story of a shepherd that had a lead sheep. You know, there's always one and all the other sheep kind of follow. And that sheep was a big troublemaker, so he ended up breaking its leg. And then he mended it, splinted it, loved on it, and that sheep just followed him anywhere and everywhere. The sheep was the most wonderful leader, but the sheep had to have the leg broken. Moses had to have his leg broken. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. The law of your mouth is better to me than thousands of gold and silver. Here's Winston Churchill. They were 2.5 years into World War II, and they hadn't won a major battle yet. They get news that they win a battle, and this is what he had to say. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And that's where Moses is. We've talked about his years being broken down into 3 sets of 40. The first 40 in Egypt, thinking he was something. The second 40 in Midian, learning he was nothing. And the last 40 between Egypt and the wilderness, seeing how God can do something with nothing. So 3 years into the war, they finally won a battle. Exodus chapter 2 says this, during those many days, 40 years passed from the well to the bush, and we get 8 verses. But there's a lot to learn about those 40 years. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. Now, here's how it goes. Moses leaves Egypt. He runs to Midian. He sits down by this well. He is exhausted. He's worn out. Here come these 7 women. All they want to do is draw water and feed their flocks. And these other shepherds come and make trouble. And he's going to come and intervene. Sounds like the intervention back in Egypt, but has a little bit of a different twist here. And this is where the learning experience starts. Moses was rejected, and he takes a Gentile bride. There'll be so many parallels between Moses and Jesus. And 3 weeks ago, because we missed 2 weeks, I handed out a sheet of paper with all the parallels between Moses and Christ. Christ, too, was rejected by his people, but took on a Gentile bride. When they came home to their father, Reuel, he has a second name also, Jethro, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? I want to make this comment about names. We used to keep horses, and we were friendly with Arab horses, and these people have these Arab horses with names that didn't even have vowels in them, it seemed like. When it's an opportunity to name a child, pick a name that's going to be inspirational. His name was Reuel, which means friend of God. It was a family name because Abraham was called a friend of God. The background of Reuel, or Jethro, he was of the bloodline. You know, when Sarah died, Abraham remarried, and he remarried a lady by the name of Keturah, and that's where this bloodline came from. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. They said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. Now, how did they know he was an Egyptian? We know that Egyptians were clean shaven, and we don't think he had enough time to grow a big burly Amish type beard. We know that Egyptians sometimes tattooed eyebrows. We don't know if he did one of those things. We don't know if he came out and he said, oh, by the way, I'm an Egyptian. We don't even know if he had an opportunity to introduce himself. Maybe he got to the well. Maybe he got something to drink. Maybe he passed out. When he woke up, there was this rumble between the ladies and the guys. An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. And he said to his daughters, then where is he? Picture this. Here's the shepherd. He's got 7 daughters, doesn't mention any sons. The daughters are trying to take care of the sheep. And here's this guy that wants to be helpful. Bring him home. We need that guy. So where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. Now, we don't know how long it took for Moses to become content. We read from Paul, he said, I've learned to be content. There must be some period of time in there because Moses is now all of a sudden married. I don't know if any of you have ever gone through a midlife crisis, but this is like the ultimate midlife crisis. Everything that he was building up towards, his education, his power, his opportunity to have the throne, all shot, all gone. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, which means stranger or sojourner, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. Israel was a sojourner 400 years. Moses was a sojourner. He says, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. He grew up in Egypt. He was born in Egypt, but his heart was elsewhere. Anybody know Philip Nolan? A short story written called A Man Without a Country. Anybody know the story of Man Without a Country? Okay, the Philip Nolan is a historic name, but the story is fiction. And it's about a lieutenant who was being tried for treason in the 1800s. And during that time, in the story, he testified, he said, I don't want anything to do with the United States. And he was sentenced to life to live on a ship and never be told anything about the US of A. And as the story climaxes, somebody goes into his cabin and he sees all this paraphernalia. He made his own flag and all this other stuff. And the climax of the story is somebody broke the law and gave him the history of the United States from Revolution, well, the early 1800s, all the way up, but not including the Civil War, because the story was written to promote patriotism for the Union for the Civil War. But that was Moses, a man without a country, born in Egypt, raised in Egypt, Israeli by heart. God hears Israel's groaning. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve my life. You stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies, and your right hand delivers me. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Do not forsake the work of your hands. So, though I walk in the midst of trouble, Moses walked for 40 years taking care of those sheep. Pharaoh and his posse all die. We're going to see that verse shortly. Posse is a bunch of people that the sheriff they go chase crooks. And Midian is God's crock pot for Moses. And what's a crock pot? It's a slow cook, right? It's a slow cook. You go in the pot raw and you come out stew. God will use Moses once he learns from failure. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Lessons learned from failure. During those many days, referring to those 40 years, and I heard this thing a couple of months ago and it stuck on me. The days are long, but the years are short. During those many days, the king of Egypt died. Single event, life to death. And the people of Israel groaned 40 years, day in, day out. Go build the city. Go home. Go find some straw. Go make some bricks. Day in and day out during those many days. Now, this psalm was written a couple centuries later, but it applies. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. People's hope was deferred. Moses' hope was deferred to the point where he was content. Maybe I'm not the deliverer. How about John the Baptist? He sent his disciples to ask Jesus, was he the Messiah, or was he supposed to look for somebody else? That's the same man who said, behold the Lamb of God. You got some doubt? There are some heavy hitters in the Bible that had some doubt. Thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against you. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. Now, this is written for people, because look at these words. God heard their groaning. Well, God is everything. He hears everything. God remembered. God knows the end from the beginning. God sees everything, and God knows everything. So this is written from a people's perspective. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So, what was happening in Egypt? Pharaoh died, the people are slaves. What's happening in the heavenlies? God is taking notice. What's happening in Midian? That's what we're going to be talking about. What's happening in Midian? So first of all, he gets a new family, a father-in-law, a Gentile wife. Now let me say this. There's this book that I'm awfully fond of called She Calls Me Daddy. And it talks about how men should be raising daughters up until the point that they're married. Then this man, Robert Wogelmuth, wrote a follow-up called She Still Calls Me Daddy. And it picks up at the wedding aisle, and it talks about how you should deal with your daughter and your son-in-law, give them space, let them have their own culture, let them have their own ways. You know, the Bible talks about leave and cleave, okay? And think about the cultural spread between I'll say Jethro, it's easier to say. Think about the cultural spread between this nomad Jethro and this kingly guy, Pharaoh. Now, you go all the way back to Joseph, and the Egyptians abhorred shepherds. So here's this guy, he's going from Pharaoh to taking care of somebody else's sheep. The Bible never said he had his own. He took care of his father-in-law's sheep. So he had a new family, a new career, keeping the sheep of his father-in-law, and a new mindset. Moses was content. And we've seen this, but now I put a sequel in the bold there. As Moses is going through this learning curve, he says, well, maybe at least I'm not as dumb as these sheep. You know, when the Bible says all we like sheep have gone astray, they picked a fine animal because they are dumb. Lessons learned from failure. Number one, experiencing failure promotes an obedient life. And number two, experiencing failure prompts a teachable spirit. Now I'm going to digress and share a story about myself. That thing on the side of that wall is called a buttress. And it's there to keep the wall from collapsing. Now, many of you know my dad was a funeral director, and he was very free with us. And I'm 16 years old, I have my driver's license, and he wants me to back up the hearse into this spot. And he said, John, all I have to do is open the driver's door and look, and you'll see a broom handle. Just aim for the broom handle. And when you feel the resistance, because he had the snow tires up there, he said, that's exactly where I want it. Well, Smarty Pants just came from driver's ed. And driver's ed said you're supposed to put your arm on the thing and look this way to back up. So that's what I did. And that buttress just took out the side of that hearse as I was backing up. I heard the squealing and the screeching of metal. I ran to Dad. He came down, we looked at it, and all he said to me was, I bet you look at the broomstick next time. That's all he had to say, because I was miserable. Promoted obedience and promoted a teachable spirit. If all else fails, read the instructions. And there are the instructions we're talking about, basic instructions before leaving earth. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. A new mindset. We talked about a new family, a new career, a new mindset. He developed a servant's attitude. Keep in mind, he was boss hog. And you see right here that as the daughters reported to dad, he even drew water for us. He didn't just shoo those other guys away because he was Mr. Macho. He went and he drew the water for those sheep. He was willing to be obscure. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, and she gave birth to a son, and she called his name Gershom. So there's Moses as he's growing up, and we used that picture when we talked about his first day at school, if you will, and he grew up in those halls, and he traded that in for that. He used to look like that, and over time, big question mark, did he look like that? Here's Deuteronomy. Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. Does that mean his hair never went gray? We don't know. Does that mean his teeth ever fell out? We don't know. But we do know one thing. I think he climbed Sinai better than I could. He learned